done, buy that brand new car, or just enable you to kick back and relax for the rest of the year. For a chance to win £30,000 in tax-free cash, text cash to 63232. Text costs £2 plus one standard network rate message. You can enter online at gbnews.com/win. Entries cost £2, or post your name and number to GB07 PO Box 8690 Derby DE1 9TT. UK only. Entrance must be 18 or over. Lines close at 5 p.m. on the 30th of August. Please check the closing time if listening or watching on demand. Good luck.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Your lunchtime update on the stories that matter across the UK.
From breaking news and insightful analysis, inspiring stories and lively debates.
You're comparing yourself to a former Prime Minister.
Which is it?
Stay informed, stay updated, stay entertained.
I just don't know how anyone would not want to be there.
Every weekday from midday.
We are Good Afternoon Britain, only on GB News.
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Nana Akweer, for an informative, interactive news programme with a difference. It's fun.
It's true. You're not wrong. No one will be cancelled. Lovely.
Join me from 3 p.m. every weekend, only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Simon Evans, and this is GB News, Britain's news channel.
Good evening. It's 7 o'clock on Friday the 5th of July, and the United Kingdom has not only a new parliament, a new prime minister, a new cabinet, we've got a new government. Yes, the people have spoken, and for the first time in more than 14 years, we have a Labour Prime Minister.
I invite you all to join this government of service in the mission of national renewal. Our work is urgent, and we begin it today.
Just 2 hours before that, Rishi Sunak was speaking outside Number 10 with a message for voters who had just kicked him out.
I have heard your anger, your disappointment, and I take responsibility for this loss.
And it was a record-breaking night for the Liberal Democrats, who won a record 71 seats. Sir Ed Davey bungee jumping his way back into the political spotlight. We'll be discussing what role this expanded party will play over the next 5 years. And Reform have entered the fray, with Nigel Farage leading their new group of 5 MPs into a new era at Westminster. Though, as we know, wherever Nigel Farage goes, protesters are sure to follow.
Thank you, mate. Where are you from? Where are you from? Oh, well, that makes sense. Yeah. Are you downwind of a couple already? You've had a bigger lunch than I've had.
The Reform Party leader was heckled by a number of protesters as he celebrated his 8th attempt, his successful attempt, at becoming an MP. Well, all of those topics and more will be discussed over the next 2 hours. But before we get into what this election means and what's next to come, here are your very latest news headlines with Sam Francis.
Tom, thank you very much, and good evening to you. It's just after 7 o'clock, and as we heard there, the UK now has its first ever female Chancellor, as the new Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, has announced his top team. Rachel Reeves takes on the role, as expected, describing the appointment today as a sign there should be no limit to the ambitions of women and girls. Earlier, she outlined her economic plans to staff at the Treasury, saying her central mission is to restore economic growth.
To deliver on this mission, I want to be the most pro-growth Treasury in our country's history. That'll mean doing what the Treasury does best, building growth on a rock of economic stability. But it also means taking on new challenges and new responsibilities. to fix the foundations and to rebuild Britain.
Members of the public were gathered outside the gates of Downing Street today to cheer prospective members of Sir Keir's new cabinet, including Angela Rayner, who's been appointed as Deputy Prime Minister. David Lammy's been made Foreign Secretary, while Yvette Cooper heads up the Home Office, and John Healey becomes the Defence Secretary. The first surprise announcement, though, was the promotion of Lisa Nandy to Culture Secretary after Thangan Debonair lost her seat to the Greens. Well, before appointing his new cabinet, Sir Keir Starmer gave his first speech outside Downing Street and promised to rebuild trust in politics.
This wound, this lack of trust, can only be healed by actions, not words. I know that. But we can make a start today with the simple acknowledgement that public service is a privilege, and that your government should treat every single person in this country with respect.
And in the last few minutes, the US President Joe Biden has been congratulating Sir Keir Starmer in a post on social media, saying that he looks forward to strengthening the special relationship between the US and the UK. So let's take a quick look at the numbers as they stand following last night's election. Labour's landslide has left the Conservatives with just 121 seats, a dramatic turnaround from the last election. This time, Labour securing 412 seats, the Liberal Democrats triumphing with 71, and a huge increase from their previous total of 11. Meanwhile, the SNP were left with 9 seats, the Greens on 2, and the other parties there you can see on the screen with their results. Meanwhile, Reform UK have claimed their 5th seat after a recount in Basildon South and East Thurrock. James McMurdoch, a last-minute candidate, has won with a narrow majority of just 98 votes over Labour's Jack Ferguson. Well, that unexpected win for Reform has come just hours after Nigel Farage was heckled as he took to the stage at an event in London. Take a listen.
You're a ruling class fraud!
Boring. Boring.
The leader was forced to delay that speech multiple times while security staff removed protesters from the venue, but he joked that it was good preparation for his new role as an MP in the House of Commons. And finally, one piece of news away from the election for you. Former nurse Lucy Letby has protested her innocence after she was sentenced to another whole-life jail term for trying to kill a baby girl. Earlier this week, she was convicted of the attempted murder of a premature baby at the Countess of Chester Hospital in 2016. The 34-year-old had already been found guilty of killing 7 babies and trying to kill 6 others at that neonatal unit between 2015 and 2016. Those are the latest GB News headlines for now. I'm Sam Francis, back with you at 8 o'clock.
For the very latest GB News direct to your smartphone, sign up to News Alerts by scanning the QR code or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
Good evening. What a 24 hours it's been. Yes, nearly an entire day since the polls have closed, and now we have a Labour government. Sir Keir Starmer has entered Downing Street and a new cabinet has been appointed. And watching those appointments as they happened was our very own political correspondent Olivia Utley, who joins us now live from Downing Street. And Olivia, I can't help notice that this election began in the rain, it's ending in the rain. A new storm has broken, has it not?
I saw you tweet that, Tom, and I chuckled at the time. Still just as funny. I was squeezing out my dress earlier. It is pouring with rain here in Downing Street. Yes, the new Prime Minister has appointed his new cabinet. He has truly hit the ground running. Most of the appointments were expected. They are people who have served in his shadow cabinet previously. So you've got Yvette Cooper as the Home Secretary, David Lammy as the Foreign Secretary. There was speculation that he wasn't going to be given won that role. You've got Louise Hay as Transport Secretary, Wes Streeting as Health Secretary. Wes Streeting has already made a very bold statement on the government's website saying that the new Labour policy is that the NHS is broken. He wants serious reform, and he's beginning that by meeting with the unions next week to talk about ending those strikes. That will probably happen now that we have a Labour government. Now, NHS reform is at the very top of the new Labour government's agenda, and that actually might be welcome news to quite a lot of Conservatives. Even Jeremy Hunt, in his very gracious concession from government speech when he won his seat unexpectedly last night, said that the Labour Party could be in a position to reform the NHS in a way that any Conservative government finds difficult to do, because it's seen as so toxic whenever the Conservatives do anything with the NHS. So that's an area where Labour is definitely going to do whatever they can as quickly as they can. Housing is going to be a little bit more tricky. Angela Rayner has been appointed as Levelling Up Secretary, which includes housing and communities, and I think she is going to have a difficult time on her hands. It's even possible that Keir Starmer, seeing her maybe as a bit of a threat, has given her a poisoned chalice. The Labour Party has promised huge reform to planning. They've promised to build so many more houses up and down the country, but they have now inherited seats from the Conservatives up and down the country, sort of rural, leafy, well-to-do, green seats, where lots of people are NIMBYs, as we call them, people who don't want new houses in their areas, often for very good reasons, because they're worried about their facilities being overwhelmed. So I think that's going to be a really, really difficult job for Angela Rayner. It was interesting, too, to hear Keir Starmer's speech at about lunchtime today. It wasn't as sort of triumphant as you might expect from a man with an enormous majority, and that could be perhaps because there is a bit of a caveat, a loveless majority, sort of some are calling it, because although Keir Starmer has won nearly as many seats as Tony Blair in 1997, he's won with just 35% of the vote, just 3 percentage points more than Jeremy Corbyn lost by in 2019. He knows that he still has a really big mountain to climb.
Really extraordinary numbers there. 33.8% of the vote, delivering 411 seats. Quite extraordinary. Real big errors in polling in terms of the number of votes Labour got, but not in terms of the number of seats they got. Olivia Utley will be catching up with you a little bit later, but thank you very much. Live from a very stormy Downing Street. Now, here is a breakdown of those results from last night. As we were saying, Labour has scooped up 412 seats, far more needed than that 326 winning post, that majority line in the House of Commons. The Liberal Democrats have picked up 71, an increase, a huge increase on the previous total of 11. And, of course, the SNP has 9. They're still fighting it out with the Liberal Democrats for the last seat in the country. That's going for another recount. It won't be declared until tomorrow. It's the only seat that is yet to be declared. So it could be the SNP are on 10, or it could be that they're on 9. And, of course, Reform UK have just picked up an extra one. They're now on 5. Well, my goodness me, let's dissect what has been an extraordinary, what is it, I suppose 21 hours maybe? Goodness me, I've been up for a very long time over the last day. Joining me is my panel, Liberal Democrats Federal Board member Callum Robertson, former Labour advisor Matthew Larser, and former aide to Margaret Thatcher, Niall Gardner. Goodness me, Matthew, we're going to have to start with you. The Labour Party has won an election for the first time since 2005.
Absolutely, and so, you know, we've been there, we've lived those days of disappointment, and so it's great that we've got a Labour government, but as you say, Tom, it's one that wasn't elected on a particularly large percentage of the vote, even it's going to have a very large majority in the House of Commons. So I thought what Keir said in his speech outside Downing Street was absolutely vital, which is this is going to be a government for all of the people and not just those who voted Labour yesterday, and it's got to be a government that's got to deliver on the bread and butter issues that people care about. So those are the two challenges going forward, which the new cabinet, which is pretty much the old shadow cabinet, with I've just noticed that Emily Thornberry has not been appointed as Attorney General. Instead, a KC who's not either house currently, who's just been appointed.
Ah, so that will be a new member of the House of Lords and of course, Sir Keir Starmer, an eminent lawyer in his own right, will probably have had thoughts about who he wanted to appoint to that position.
He knows his lawyers.
And he was Ed Miliband going to win the 2015 election? He would have been Attorney General in Ed Miliband's first cabinet, so say all sorts of reports.
No, that's pretty.
Niall, this is a crisis moment for conservatism in the United Kingdom? Because yes, we can say that the Labour Party has won on a very low share of the vote, but the reason why they've won so much is that the Conservative share of the vote is even lower.
Yes, well, I think it was a catastrophically bad night for the Conservatives. They're going to have to rebuild. And I think we need to see the Conservative Party returning to conservative values, principles and ideas. The party has shifted more to the centre ground under Rishi Sunak. That's alienated, I think, a lot of Conservative voters. Many went to reform, many stayed at home. This is certainly a party in a real sense of crisis, but I think it can rebuild itself. It can go through a period of regeneration. It needs the right leadership. If it moves, I think, to the left, as some are advocating, I think that would be disastrous for the party. If it moves rightwards and rediscovers its Thatcherite, Churchillian, roots, I do think that it can be a very successful party. Again, if you look at the Labour vote, just 35%, that's not exactly a massive endorsement. And I do think the Conservatives can come back 5 years from now, but they cannot continue the kind of Sunak-style wet politics that we've seen.
In some ways, listening to what Keir Starmer has said today, I want to be a government for all the people, not just those who voted for me. I remember back to 2019. It was in this very building. We're inside the QE2 Centre in Westminster. This is where Boris Johnson came upon winning that election. He held a sort of press event with a big banner behind him and Michael Gove and all sorts of others saying, "The people's government. We know that you've only lent us our votes and we'll do everything we can to maintain and repay that trust." Many people were saying that that coalition that Boris Johnson built, a disparate coalition, northern voters, southern voters, rich voters, poor voters, all the rest of it, it was a broad anti-Corbyn coalition, but it was very, very brittle. I'm looking at this coalition that Keir Starmer's put together. North, south, rich, poor, a broad anti-Sunak coalition. But as soon as that big uniting factor of being anti-Tory goes away, Matthew, potentially that coalition can dissolve as quickly as Boris Johnson's.
Well, I think you're right, but I think the difference with Boris is that Boris's coalition was centred around an idea which is getting Brexit done, whereas this coalition was centred around getting the Tories out. So that's an opportunity for Keir to define what his mission is and what he can get that coalition to unite around in government. I mean, in a way that perhaps hasn't been sort of central to how people chose how to vote yesterday. It was very tactical across the countries. You know, we've seen the great triumph for the Lib Dems, the Greens, etc. And even Plaid doubling its number of MPs from Wales.
Yeah, and it's right we turn to the Liberal Democrats now, because what an astonishing growth in numbers of seats. Not a growth in number of votes, but an astonishing growth in number of seats.
What we've seen since 2019, when our party, I think it's fair to be honest to say, was on the precipice. We've come back from there. We've taken a new strategy. We've looked at how our target voters think, how they feel, and actually we've really honed in and lasered in on that. And I think that has been recognised in numbers even we weren't expecting in the last 24 hours. I mean, 71 seats, and that's still with Inverness in play.
It could be 72.
It could be 72. I mean, this is... Inverness is Charles Kennedy's old seat. This is winning back Heartland, but it's also winning home county seats we've never even touched before. We've got a new voter base that actually, as I think the Tories start to divide themselves over the next 2 years about what their future is, will be, strictly speaking, providing the real opposition to the new Labour government in Parliament.
Now, in Oxfordshire, for example, there's not a single Tory left. In the urban areas, it's Labour. In the rural areas, it's Liberal Democrat. It's similar, but not exactly the same in Cambridgeshire. We're looking at perhaps a displacement in some of these more well-to-do parts of the country, in the southwest as well, of the Conservatives for the Liberal Democrats. That means you've got a very different type of Member of Parliament there, perhaps compared to 2005 when you held a lot of inner cities. Does that mean the party will change, given who it's representing?
I think that's a very interesting question. I mean, to hit on your sort of 2005 point, we built our 97 to 2010 coalition of voters around this idea of community politics. You're well-to-do, hard-working local councillor who sort of works his way up and becomes an MP. we've got a very different category of MPs now. We've got Paul Kohler in Wimbledon. I mean, Paul Kohler's a law professor by trade. What's his background? He was on the Law Commission with Baroness Hale. These are serious professionals who can provide serious scrutiny to a Labour government, can really hold Labour's feet to the fire on issues like civil liberties, which we know the history of the Labour Party is not great on.
Ah, so this is interesting, not just on sort of the rural, perhaps, planning, countryside issues, sewage that you've been talking a lot, but actually if the Labour Party were to introduce ID cards or longer day detention and all of these sorts of things, that's where the Liberal Democrats could be talking again. We're going to come back to this a little bit later in the programme, but my goodness me, there is so much to talk about. Coming up, after a shocking night at the polls, the Conservatives need to regroup. Sir John Redwood, once a leadership contender for his own party, will join us to give us his thoughts on the future of conservatism in the United Kingdom. That's after the break.
In the GB newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens.
With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, GB News brings you accurate reporting of the day's topical agenda.
When the news breaks, wherever and whenever it's happening,
we'll be there.
This is GB News,
the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Martin Daubney, weekdays from 3 p.m.
Prince Harry obviously set up the Invictus Games in collaboration with Prince William and Catherine, the Princess of Wales, as part of their royal foundation, but Prince Harry took it under his wing separately. And last month he celebrated the 10th anniversary back in London. It's Invictus Games is an Olympic-style competition to help wounded veterans from various different countries with their rehabilitation through the power of sport. And that's what he's being honoured for. The reason he's got it is because of the positive impacts, and I quote, on veteran communities through the power of sport. Pat Tillman, what the award is named after, he was a US war veteran. He was killed in Afghanistan in 2004. Prince Harry, of course, served 2 tours himself. Whether he deserves it, Martin, to answer your question, clearly the judges think that that is the case. Of course, I think what we're seeing from Prince Harry over the last couple of months is him really focusing on his passion, which is helping veterans and helping families of veterans, rather than what we've seen over the last few years, which is him talking about himself and complaining about his life as a working member of the royal family.
Now, Cameron, nobody can deny the importance of the Invictus Games. What an amazing achievement. Perhaps Prince Harry's finest achievement in terms of public relations.
Having someone like Prince Harry or another working member of the royal family with their fame can spotlight very worthy causes, such as the plight of veterans and those who feel like they've been left behind and do not have enough support when they come out of the British Armed Forces. And that's something, as you alluded to, Martin, that Prince Harry perhaps arguably has done very successfully over the last decade. And if Prince Harry's name wasn't on the Invictus Games, would it have done so well? That's probably the arguments they'd make. But as you say, not everyone's happy about the fact that Prince Harry's involved, but he is. Clearly, many people think he deserves it because he's getting this award in Los Angeles.
GB News, the People's Channel.
Join me, Neil Oliver, every Sunday night at 6 p.m. on GB News. And if an hour is not nearly enough for you, go to gbnews.com for special extended episodes online every Friday at 9 p.m, where we can truly get into the nitty-gritty of what's going on.
GB News, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Nana Akweer, for an informative, interactive news programme with a difference. It's fun.
It's true. You're not wrong. No one will be cancelled.
Lovely. Join me from 3 p.m. every weekend, only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Good evening. It's 21 minutes past 7 on an extraordinary day in British politics. Now, for those who know their politics, last night's result in Wokingham was one of the biggest shocks. The Liberal Democrats candidate, Clive Jones, was elected as the town's new MP. The first time ever that the Conservatives had not won in that seat. In Wokingham, perhaps the Conservatives had become too anti-woke. Well, the Conservatives have held that seat since 1885, and a long-time member serving for that seat was, of course, Sir John Redwood. He had been Wokingham's MP since 1987, before he decided not to stand in this election. And Sir John Redwood joins me now. Sir John, why do you think the Lib Dems were able to take this seat?
Well, they were able to take it for a variety of reasons. The main reason was that a Reform candidate stood in the seat and attracted quite a lot of Conservative voters who were worried that the government hadn't done enough on immigration, on inflation, on lower taxation, and so they were attracted to the Reform package. And then quite a lot of other Conservative voters who were also unimpressed by the 4.5-year record of the government decided to stay at home. So Wokingham, like other parts of the country, saw rather lower turnout. So the combination of stay-away Conservatives and switching Conservatives to Reform obviously took out the majority that I had enjoyed in the past.
Now, of course, you were there on the front row for what happened in 1997. How similar does this feel to that previously largest drubbing that the Conservatives had experienced?
I think this is a bit more difficult. I mean, this is bigger than that one. I held Wokingham in 1997 with a reasonable majority. Why is this worse? I think it's worse because it isn't just one issue. I mean, what went wrong in 1997 was that John Major had accepted official advice from Bank and Treasury, and the encouragement of the official opposition had taken us into an economy-wrecking scheme called the European Economic Mechanism and the exchange rate mechanism. And I'd been an opponent of that. I challenged him over it because I thought it was a very damaging thing to be doing. Unfortunately, it was very damaging, and so there was an inflation followed by a deep recession. People were naturally extremely angry about the economic incompetence, and it didn't matter that the opposition parties had all signed up to it and were urging it. It didn't matter that the CBI wanted it. It was very bad policy, and the government of the day perished because of it. And I realised it was going to take time to rebuild our position, but it was one signal important mistake. And sure enough, some years later, when Labour made a worse economic policy mistake, then the thing was wiped out and we got back into office again. It's more
John,
difficult this time.
Is the last 20, 30 years of British political history just waiting for governments to make an economic error? You had the ERM crisis in 1992, interest rates going up to, what was it, 14% overnight, and the Conservatives never regaining their economic reputation for competence. Then you have 2008, the financial crisis, the reputation that the Labour Party had built up for economic competence collapses, and then you have the events of October 2022, interest rates rise actually to a fairly moderate level by historical standards, but right up from the artificial low to which they had been kept, and suddenly people are paying many times more for their mortgages. Is that basically the story of the last 30 years of British politics, an economic one?
Well, I think it's broadly the story. I would add some details to what's happened more recently. Because, of course, interest rates surged before and after the unfortunate Truss Kwarteng budget, which was not well judged, and they were going up globally. And fortunately, we didn't have a major recession in the way that the exchange rate mechanism caused a major recession under the Conservatives, and the boom-bust under Labour caused an even bigger Great Recession at the end of the first decade of this century. But also, I think the problems at the moment are more complicated because it wasn't just the economic issues, although the cost of living hit was probably the number one issue. But I think migration was a mighty part of what went wrong because the Conservatives had promised in 2019 we would take back control of our borders as part of the Brexit package. And then instead, ministers licensed an increase in legal migration on a scale we've never seen before. And instead of it going down from 200,000 a year, it more than trebled. And so I think people felt really
Sir John,
badly
your
let down.
party has got a mixed record about picking leaders after big election defeats. And it always seems to be the case that the anointed one, perhaps the member's favourite, never quite gets to be the one to get the crown. Not many people saw William Hague taking on the leadership in 97. Even fewer still saw it going to Ian Duncan Smith after 2001, and then to Michael Howard in a coronation. I mean, these were events that were very peculiar. Most people expected it to go to Michael Portillo, at least at some stage, across those years. What mistakes were made in the past about leadership that might need to be avoided now that the Conservative Party is entering a period of soul-searching?
Well, it's very difficult to draw conclusions because the personalities are all different, and we've no idea at the moment who the runners and riders will be out of the rather limited number of members of Parliament that have been elected in the Conservative cause. But what I would say is that I think it would be a big mistake to say to the members of the party, you can't play a role in this in the future. We have precious few members left in the Conservative Party anyway as a result of various events. And I think in opposition, the members would want to be part of the process and they would want to be able to cast a vote. I think the two-tier election system was a very sensible compromise so that the members get to choose from two perfectly good candidates that the members of parliament can live with, because the leader is primarily the leader of the members of parliament, but the leader is also the leader of the wider party. And when you're in opposition, the role of the leader as leading the party is a much more important proportion of the total job than when your leader is the Prime Minister. And for example, in opposition, it was very important that David Cameron, when he became leader, decided that he could take the Conservative Party out of the European People Party's grouping within the European Union, because that was a very clear symbol that we were a federalist party and we were trying to appeal to people who didn't want a European federation. So there are...
And yet many people describe the Conservative Parliamentary Party as the most sophisticated electorate on the planet, always trying to game the outcome. For example, what we saw in 2001 was the members' favourite was never put to the members. You had Ken Clarke versus IDS, and of course the membership went with the non-Europhile option. But perhaps more recently, all sorts of allegations about lending votes, whether Boris Johnson lent votes to Jeremy Hunt so that he didn't face a Brexiteer in 2019, whether Rishi Sunak lent votes to Liz Truss so that he didn't have to face Kemi Badenoch in 2022. There were many, many different allegations of this sort of two-round system, how it's been manipulated, gamed, and perhaps been detrimental to the fortunes of the party.
Well, I didn't see any evidence of those particular examples of gaming you give me, and I certainly wasn't playing games myself. My advice for Conservative MPs is to vote for the person you would most trust and believe would have most appeal to the party in the country. Because what you've got to do as the opposition leader, particularly if you don't have many troops in Parliament, is to work out some campaigns that are popular, are bold, are going to cut through with the wider public, as well as be a good thing to argue within Parliament. And they've got to be well-based. You should support the government when it's setting out to do the right thing. Quite a lot of the aims of the new Labour government are fine. The idea that we should be fastest growing economy in the G7, absolutely great idea. It could be my idea. I'm delighted Labour want it. But I think there are going to be a lot of arguments about have they got the policies to achieve it? I don't think they have yet. And are they going to listen? And there's a role for the opposition immediately. What are we going to say about growth? Because it didn't work out that well over the last 5 years. You can blame COVID, you can blame the Ukraine war, I blame the Bank of England, I blame Treasury rules, I blame all sorts of things. Those need to be unpacked, and there needs to be an authentic Conservative view on how things can be better and more positive. I found it very difficult to get the government or a lot of my fellow MPs to understand what the Bank of England was doing. And the Bank of England is right out on a limb, selling bonds at huge losses and sending the bill to the taxpayers. And then no wonder we don't have any money for tax cuts or for getting the health waiting list down.
There's a huge amount to dissect, and I hasten to say it's the end of the election, but it's not even the end of the beginning. It's barely the beginning of what happens next for the Conservative Party. So, John Redwood, thank you very much for joining us this evening. Really appreciate your time and your knowledge as well. Well, coming up, it's the first Labour government for a generation. Sir Keir Starmer finally got the party back to the centre ground, or so he says. But how long will that last? That's what we'll be discussing with the panel after the break.
Hello, very good evening to you. Here's your latest GB News weather forecast coming to you from the Met Office. This weekend's looking relatively cool and showery for many of us, but before then we do have some heavy persistent rain around. Today we've had a waving front across southern parts bringing some wet weather here, and then a pulse of heavy persistent rain is pushing its way northeastwards across England as we go through this evening and overnight, clearing through though as we go through the early hours of tomorrow morning. That being said, there will be some heavy persistent rain lingering across northern parts of Scotland, which could cause some localised issues. Elsewhere, some showery rain, but also some clear skies, under which, away from the towns and cities, we're likely to dip into single figures. So a bit of a fresh start for the time of year. If we look in more detail, and as I mentioned, there will be some heavy persistent rain across some northern parts of Scotland. We could see some high totals building up, chance of a bit of flooding and some difficult driving conditions here. Heading further south though, and there will be some showers perhaps across parts of Northern Ireland and into northern England too. Watch out for some heavy showery rain affecting more central parts of England and into Wales too. And then across more southern parts of England, we're likely to have just a mixture of sunny spells and a few scattered showers around. As we go through the day, some of the heavier, more frequent showery rain should clear away of sorts, but there will be plenty of showers around as we go through the afternoon, particularly towards the north and west. Further south and east, perhaps a greater chance of seeing something a little bit drier, but even here, 1 or 2 showers are possible. There will be some blustery winds around, and with temperatures below average for the time of year, it is going to feel relatively cool for most of us. Overnight, the showers should largely die out, so Sunday is actually likely to start mostly dry for many places, but quite quickly we're going to see a rash of showers developing, many of us likely to catch some showers, and they could be heavy, possibly even thundery at times too, and temperatures still on the low side for the time of year. Monday at the moment looks largely dry before more wet weather arrives later on. Bye-bye.
Are the newspapers getting you down?
My wife didn't divorce me that month.
Struggling to separate the wheat from the chaff?
I know that it's a bit of a circus at the best of times.
Well, don't worry, Headliners has got you covered. We'll take the burden of reading the day's news, and if we get depressed, who cares? It's an occupational hazard, frankly. That's Headliners on GB News from 11 p.m. till midnight, and the following morning, 5 till 6 a.m. on GB News, the comedy channel. Nah, just kidding. Britain's news channel.
I'm Patrick Christie's. Every weeknight from 9, I bring you 2 hours of unmissable, explosive debate and headline-grabbing interviews. What impact has that had?
We got death threats and the bomb threats on.
As time passes,
She could have saved Storm.
You made my argument for me.
My guests and I tackle the issues that really matter, with a sharp take on every story.
Went everywhere.
something practical could be done.
Or I can become something different. Patrick Christie's tonight from 9 p.m. only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Good evening, it's 34 minutes past 7 on this, a pretty extraordinary election aftermath programme. Now, when Jeremy Corbyn was elected Labour leader 9 years ago, the party was fragmented as ever. In the 2019 election, Labour had half the amounts of seats that they gained at this election. So when Sir Keir Starmer took over the party in 2020, he had his work cut out to flip Labour upside down, to turn it inside out. And potentially he has. Entering Downing Street with 412 seats, our new Prime Minister has what some might describe as a supermajority behind him. But how has Sir Keir Starmer achieved this all? Well, I'm delighted to be still with my panel, Niall Gardner, Matthew Larzer and Callum Robertson. Matthew, Keir Starmer has undoubtedly changed the Labour Party, at least in perception. Many people will be wondering, is that all surface level?
No, I mean, there were no reds under the bed, as it were. I mean, he has ruthlessly changed the Labour Party at every level, in particular on candidate selection, which is a sort of boring thing political nerds like us get excited about, but actually means who your local MP is, because of the party's choice. He's been ruthless on that. They've controlled it in a way that no party leader, frankly, of any political party, has ever done before. And Tony Blair, when he was around, looked at the 100 top target seats, saw that the candidates were all right there, forgot about the rest. Keir Starmer's gone right down the list. So all these people who won by 18 votes yesterday, etc., are all basically in the Starmer mould.
No, it's very interesting. They're called the Storm Troopers to some extent, I believe. Niall, this is an almost unprecedented level of control over a party. Can it last?
Well, that's a very good question, and I think it's only a matter of time before the Labour Party starts to engage in infighting and tearing itself apart. I think that's going to happen. This is still, of course, a party of the left, and Starmer describes himself as a socialist. This is not a centrist party in my view, and I think this is a real problem for Britain, because Britain's not a socialist country, but you've got a socialist government. It's also, I think, a very woke political party ideologically. It's actually very similar in many respects to Biden's Democratic Party. which actually has been the most left-wing government in US history under Joe Biden, even though Biden presented himself as a sort of centrist figure. But if you look at how the Democrats have governed in the United States, it's been very left-wing. And I do think we're going to see that with the Labour Party here. A lot of remnants still of Jeremy Corbyn's ideology as well. You look at that over the Gaza issue, over talk about, having Netanyahu prosecuted by the ICC, all of this very extreme stuff. And that's coming from David Lammy, the new Foreign Secretary. So I'm very concerned.
Yeah, well, Matthew, you're shaking your head, but let's bring in Callum, because you're also shaking your head.
I mean, the language used, calling Labour socialist, the woke stuff, it's the dying flagellations of a
Keir
party.
Starmer called himself a socialist.
Yeah, exactly.
But if you're a socialist, you don't appoint Lisa Nandy to the cabinet.
I think Lisa Nandy would describe herself as a socialist.
I think she'd describe herself as a social democrat.
Most of the cabinet would. I mean, Rachel Reeves, for example, who's just been put in charge of the nation's finances, very much describes herself as a social democrat and refuses the label. I mean, this is a social democratic government. I mean, you might argue it's slightly divided by Biden.
There is an interesting, I think, delineation there between what Rachel Reeves says, social democrat, and what Sir Keir Starmer says, which is socialist. And perhaps there is. I'm not trying to make it.
It's one of those parlour games that Labour politicians play, and they slightly play to the Labour gallery if you call yourself a socialist. I think it's not a radical agenda. And he's been clear. Pat McFadden, who's absolutely at the heart of the government, he's not particularly publicly facing. Was a bit during the election as the campaign coordinator, but is a backroom operator of first class. Is the person put it together. And Pat is no left wing. He's no sort of left winger in the Corbynite mould. He's a total social democrat.
Well, let's bring in Susie Stride now, Labour Party activist, because Susie, I think you were more in favour of perhaps the level of democracy that was seen in the Labour Party under the previous leadership. Do you have concerns about this new government?
Sorry, what are we calling the previous leadership? Do you mean Corbyn?
Under Jeremy Corbyn, the sort of internal democracy that there was there.
No, I mean, I was very much someone that was not happy with, the previous leadership.
Right.
I struggled to find people that were. And if they were, they, for me, were pretty out of touch with the normality of British life, what makes this country great. So, no, I wasn't...
But there will be lots of people, Susie, who say that actually you look at the sort of allegations that were thrown at that leadership, the mandatory reselections, for example. That was, of course, targeting some MPs, but after all, it was democratic in that there was a vote. This time round with selections, what we saw was a central NEC body of just 3 people imposing candidates on local parties, imposing candidates on local areas, often with no connection to those areas.
Yeah, I mean, you bring up different things. Look, ultimately, under Corbyn, just so you know, they also just put people in, OK? I mean, I saw that myself. I went for Poplar and Limehouse and I was blocked by Jeremy Corbyn, and that was completely stitched up, and that happened across the country in various seats. So Jeremy Corbyn is definitely not someone to raise up as a man of democracy, as far as I'm concerned. I agree with you. Look, I love the Labour Party. I campaigned for Blair in 1997 when I was 15 years old. I love the Labour Party. I ran for Parliament myself. However, if I was going to be honest with you, am I happy with what just happened? No, I don't like it. I don't like that a couple of friends, NEC people, buddies, don't like that kind of thing. Sorry, that's not Labour to me. However, I don't put the criticism of Keir. I don't actually think Keir was to do that. But anyway, am I happy about that? No. I will always be part of the Labour Party. And for me, going forward, I would like to fight to make sure that that doesn't happen again. But ultimately, most of the things leading up to that were good selections, and they were done democratically and they were done well.
OK, well, Susie, we're having a little bit of a problem with your line, but Susie Stride, Labour Party activist, really appreciate your time. Thank you for joining us. Matthew Larzer, just before we head to the break, you've got some news.
Yes.
You've seen an interesting appointment as this reshuffle is going on.
Absolutely. Probably better known because of his role in the COVID pandemic and all those daily briefings. Patrick Vallance, the former Chief Scientific Advisor to the government, who we all saw, at the lectern during the pandemic. He's been appointed as Science Minister, will be put into the House of Lords, and he endorsed several Labour policies during the election, and it's paid off for him.
Goodness me, a former impartial civil servant, now a Labour Party minister. Make of that what you will. Well, coming up, Labour won around 34% of votes, but more than 60% of seats. So it's the age-old question, does the first past the post system work? Michael Crick will be joining us after the break.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Your lunchtime update on the stories that matter across the UK.
From breaking news and insightful analysis, inspiring stories and lively debates. You're comparing yourself to a former Prime Minister.
Which is it?
Stay informed, stay updated, stay entertained.
I just don't know how anyone would not want to be there.
Every weekday from midday.
We are Good Afternoon Britain, only on GB News.
Britain's news channel.
Sunday with Michael Portillo from 11, only on GB News.
The Royal Academy's annual exhibition has returned for the 256th time to brighten the summer holidays. It's the world's oldest open submission exhibition. Anyone can enter work to be considered for inclusion. I'm joined now by art critic J.J. Charlesworth for his verdict. What is your verdict?
My verdict is you should go and see it. You are confronted with many things of varying quality, selected by artists, and you very much, instead of being given something to you that's supposed to be good, you have to make your own decision.
I went along yesterday, and I personally did see some pictures on the wall that I thought were absolutely stunning. I'm going to mention Peter Ucker, which I think is a remark. And now these are the two by Ben Jonson, Grundtvig 1, and we've got one coming out of Berlin Pool. I think that's an absolutely stunning piece of work. And then Claire Douglas should be up. Here we are, Claire Douglas.
Yes.
Souvenir from the Anthropocene.
Yeah.
That last one, actually, a very witty painting.
A piece like that was really interesting. I think it caught a lot of people's eyes because it had very kind of humorous, slightly bleak take on post-Brexit Britain. It's set in this fictitious world of Brummington, which is a sort of loose satire on Birmingham. I thought it was a bit mean.
I think we had maybe Black Lives Matter. We had Boris Johnson. I think our own Jacob Rees-Mogg made his way into the painting.
Yeah, so there's definitely a slant, a political slant, on the part of the artist. But even that said, I thought it was an interesting and enjoyable work, even though maybe you don't agree with the artist on what they're trying to say. And I think that actually made for an interesting moment because you're seeing that people are disagreeing, right? Both through the artwork and in front of artworks.
GB News, the People's Channel.
Hi there, I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm going to take a second to tell you all about my show, Dubes & Co. We start off with the issues of the day. We then bring in both sides of the arguments. We get rid of the disrespect. And then you throw me into the mix. And trust me, I'll tell it exactly how it is. And then, of course, the magic ingredient, you at home. We mix it all together and what have we got, in my opinion, the best debate show in town. Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Goodness me, much is happening. Just to update you on some junior ministerial appointments, not only has Sir Patrick Vallance been appointed as a minister in the Health Department, but so too has James Timpson been appointed as a Justice Minister. Yes, that's James Timpson of Timpsons. Well, let's move on now, because calls to change the voting system are as much a part of the post-election aftermath as the Prime Ministerial motorcade swooping into Buckingham Palace, or a speech in front of that famous black door. However, this time, should we take it more seriously? Labour have just increased their vote share by around 1.6% on their lowest result since 1935, but increased their number of seats by 211. Whilst the Reform vote share is 14.3%, and that vote has been rewarded by 5 seats. So, is the case for electoral reform now overwhelming? Well, we're joined by the journalist and broadcaster Michael Crick. And Michael, this is perhaps strangely reminiscent of 1983, except precisely in reverse.
I'm just trying to think that one through.
83, you mean a Labour...
How the SDP split the Labour vote. They got 25% apiece, and Margaret Thatcher came through with 400 seats. This time around, you've got Reform and the Tories, and Labour coming through with around 400 seats.
Exactly. And indeed, you know, the setting up of the SDP a couple of years before that, in 81, really... dogged Labour throughout the 80s, and it delayed Labour's return to power because there were always a significant number of Labour types who joined the SDP, and eventually they either came back or some of them, like Danny Finkelstein, went off to the Conservatives. I mean, again and again in our history, we've seen Labour in opposition, but I mean, this was true before the war, you know, believing in proportional representation, and then when they get into government they think, oh well, we don't need proportional representation again, we've just had an amazing election victory, so let's forget about it. And I think that's what you're going to see now, even though the Labour Party conference, I think on more than one occasion, if I remember rightly, in recent years has voted for PR. The big unions, which still play something of a role in the party, most of them now believe in PR. The constituencies overwhelmingly, at the last time they were asked, anyway, a year or two ago, believed in PR. So in normal times, the atmosphere should be right, really, to bring it in. But of course, Labour think they've won this resounding victory, which of course they have in terms of seats, but they haven't in terms of the popular vote, as you quite rightly point out. And is this going to get anywhere? I don't know. But what I would say is this, that what's happened to reform, and I don't support or vote for reform, as you might expect, but I do think it is a gross injustice. And it's a worse injustice than anything that the Liberal Democrats suffered. I mean, maybe what UKIP suffered in 2015 was even worse, because they got nearly 4 million votes and only one MP. Now at least Reform have got 5. So I think I do think.
And yet, Michael, arguably, is this not the system working? The system is designed to give stable majority government. Lots of people wanted to give the Tories a kicking. They weren't quite sure on the Labour Party. Votes split all over the place. But in the end, we've ended with a strong majority government, at least for the next 5 years. Now, this coalition is a weakly compiled coalition that could completely collapse. This could be a one-term government with a massive majority. But surely that's the system working. The country wanted to get rid of the Tories, and they have.
Well, they may have wanted to get rid of the Tories, but the country couldn't agree as to who should replace the Tories. Should it be Labour or Reform or the Lib Dems or the Greens or one of the nationalist parties?
Surely it's better to have a majority government than a sort of mess of a hung parliament where we spend the next 12 months horse trading.
Not on this scale. And the danger is actually on the other side, the what's happened to Reform side of the argument. Because if Reform, at subsequent elections, carry on getting huge votes and they go above 4 million, 5, 6, 7, and they still don't get very many MPs, I think a lot of Reform supporters are going to lose faith in the democratic system. And I think that this, we at least have to start thinking about this. And another thing, I think, and which the government could remedy right now, this evening, if they wanted to, is appointments to the House of Lords. There's been a sort of ban on any party led by Nigel Farage having people appointed to the House of Lords. That's another injustice, and I've said so before. And they could remedy that tonight, because it's if a party has got that 14% of the vote, they should have a decent number of peers, and all they've got in the Lords are people who happen to be there in the first place and defected. And the Lords, I think it's a ridiculous institution. Nonetheless, it is part of our legislature, and we should do something about it. I mean, there are other problems we've got coming up the road as well. The low turnout, which is only going to be made worse, I think, by bringing the voting age down, to which this party anyway, is committed. I think it's bonkers, frankly, because turnout is at its lowest. You may not agree with me as a young man, but turnout is at its lowest amongst the youngest voters. And if you take the voting age down to 16, it's likely to depress turnout even more.
Yeah, no, I might look young, but I can promise you I am older than 16. This does not
I think I'd realise that.
affect me. No, I actually once ran a campaign at university many years ago to lower the voting age to 12. It was a satirical campaign because I was sort of saying that, well, if you're age 16, you're not allowed to drive, you're not allowed to fight for your country, you're not allowed to drink alcohol, you're not allowed to smoke, but you're not allowed to do any of those things at 12 either, so why not? Anyway, we're getting slightly distracted. It does seem like it's a peculiar thing that we've got different ages for different rights and responsibilities. But you've been following some of these candidates of the Labour Party as well. And just before we go, I do want to get your take on what the next House of Commons looks like, because there'll be a lot of new faces that are very unknown to the general public.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you look at overwhelmingly the new people are Labour, of course. And if you look at them, there's a lot of people who've got really boring titles like communications consultant or public affairs consultant, the sort of jobs that, you sort of think, well, what they sort of, anyway, whatever. There's far too many of them. But there are a lot of clearly very talented people in the Labour ranks and the sort of people who you don't normally think of as Labour MPs, businessmen who've made a lot of money, people who've spent time in the armed forces. There's at least a dozen of those. People who've... and people have, there's a classicist who, is from King's College who's been teaching classics in a private school. Again, you wouldn't have expected that in the past from the Labour Party. My favourite is a new guy called Brian Leishman. Yeah, I think he's going to be quite a character, this guy. He's from Brian Leishman. He's on the Labour left, which is extremely rare. And he is a professional golfer. In the sense that he's, done he's PGA accredited, and he's the professional golfer at Alloa Golf Club. In other words, he runs the shop and he, teaches people how to play better golf. I don't think there's ever been a professional golfer in Parliament ever before. And my other favourite, not Labour, is a Liberal Democrat called Ros Savage, who's the new MP for South Cotswold. Again, a sports person. And she has rowed solo, single-handedly across the world's three biggest oceans, the Pacific, the Atlantic, and the Indian Ocean. She's the first person ever the only woman ever to have done that, and she's in the Guinness Book of Records for having done so.
These members of Parliament are a sketch writer's dream. We're going to be reading about all sorts of rowing and golfing metaphors and how people have sort of...
Endless numbers who've been in bands of various kinds. One or two of them didn't get elected, actually, like Tom Gray in Brighton Pavilion, who looked like being a real loose cannon because he described the royal family as parasites only in 2020. I'm amazed he got through the Labour vetting process. But the Labour vetting process
I look forward to meeting and greeting a host of new characters. And we'll have these people populate our television screens and get to know them, I'm sure, very well over the next 4 or 5 years. But for now, Michael Crick, thank you so much for joining me this evening. So much more to come in the next hour. We're going to look at reform and talk to one of their rising stars.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello, very good evening to you. Here's your latest GB News weather forecast coming to you from the Met Office. This weekend's looking relatively cool and showery for many of us, but before then we do have some heavy persistent rain around. Today we've had a waving front across southern parts bringing some wet weather here, and then a pulse of heavy persistent rain is pushing its way northeastwards across England as we go through this evening and overnight, clearing through though as we go through the early hours of tomorrow morning. That being said, there will be some heavy persistent rain lingering across northern parts of Scotland, which could cause some localised issues. Elsewhere, some showery rain, but also some clear skies, under which, away from the towns and cities, we're likely to dip into single figures. So a bit of a fresh start for the time of year. If we look in more detail, and as I mentioned, there will be some heavy persistent rain across some northern parts of Scotland. We could see some high totals building up, chance of a bit of flooding and some difficult driving conditions here. Heading further south though, and there will be some showers perhaps across parts of Northern Ireland and into northern England too. Watch out for some heavy showery rain affecting more central parts of England and into Wales too, and then across more southern parts of England we're likely to have just a mixture of sunny spells and a few scattered showers around. As we go through the day, some of the heavier, more frequent showery rain should clear away of sorts, but there will be plenty of showers around as we go through the afternoon, particularly towards the north and west. Further south and east, perhaps a greater chance of seeing something a little bit drier, but even here, 1 or 2 showers are possible. There will be some blustery winds around, and with temperatures below average for the time of year, it is going to feel relatively cool for most of us. Overnight, the showers should largely die out, so Sunday is actually likely to start mostly dry for many places, but quite quickly we're going to see a rash of showers developing, many of us likely to catch some showers, and they could be heavy, possibly even thundery at times too, and temperatures still on the low side for the time of year. Monday at the moment looks largely dry before more wet weather arrives later on. Bye-bye.
That warm feeling inside from Boxed Boilers. Sponsored.
£30,000 in tax-free cash really could be yours. It's our biggest cash prize of the year so far, and you could be getting that winning call from us to tell you that you're our next Great British Giveaway winner.
You're joking. Really? Seriously? It's not a line, what is it?
I'm slipping neck. Oh dear.
Oh my God. This is amazing.
I'm in shock. Like I said, I've never won anything like this.
That is absolutely fantastic. We're over the moon. Thank you.
For a chance to win £30,000 in tax-free cash, text cash to 63232. Text costs £2 plus 1 standard network rate message. You can enter online at gbnews.com/win. Entries cost £2, or post your name and number to GB07 PO Box 8690 Derby DE1 9TT. UK only. Entrance must be 18 or over. Lines close at 5 p.m. on the 30th of August. Please check the closing time if listening or watching on demand. Good luck.
Weekdays on GB News. Wake up to breakfast every day from 6 a.m. Followed by Britain's newsroom at 9:30. At noon, it's Good Afternoon Britain. Followed by Martin Daubney from 3 p.m. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Nana Akwe, for an informative, interactive news programme with a difference. It's fun.
It's true. You're not wrong. No one will be cancelled. Lovely.
Join me from 3 p.m. every weekend, only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Neil Oliver, every Sunday night at 6 p.m. on GB News. And if an hour is not nearly enough for you, go to gbnews.com for special extended episodes online every Friday at 9 p.m, where we can truly get into the nitty-gritty of what's going on.
GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Patrick Christie's. Every weeknight from 9, I bring you 2 hours of unmissable, explosive debate and headline-grabbing interviews. What impact has that had?
We got death threats and the bomb threat and so on.
As time passes,
She could have said Storm. You made my argument for me.
My guest and I tackle the issues that really matter, with a sharp take on every story.
Went everywhere.
something practical could be done.
Or I can become something different.
Patrick Christie's tonight from 9 p.m. only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Are the newspapers getting you down?
My wife didn't divorce me that month.
Struggling to separate the wheat from the chaff?
I know that it's a bit of a circus at the best of times.
Well, don't worry, Headliners has got you covered. We'll take the burden of reading the day's news, and if we get depressed, who cares? It's an occupational hazard, frankly. That's Headliners on GB News from 11 p.m. till midnight, and the following morning, 5 till 6 a.m. on GB News, the comedy channel. Nah, just kidding. Britain's news channel.
Good evening. Welcome to GB News. It's 8 o'clock on Friday the 5th of July, the start of a new era of politics in this country. For the first time in more than 14 years, we have a Labour Prime Minister.
I invite you all to join this government of service in the mission of national renewal. Our work is urgent, and we begin it today.
Sir Keir was speaking just a couple of hours after Rishi Sunak left Downing Street for the last time. And the outgoing Prime Minister had a message for the voters who'd just kicked him out.
I have heard your anger, your disappointment, and I take responsibility for this loss.
And we'll be looking at a record-breaking night for the Lib Dems, who've won 71 seats and might yet still win one more. Maybe all that paddleboarding and bungee jumping just did the trick. We'll also be discussing the rise of the Reform Party with that party's biggest donor here in this studio. That's all to come after your news headlines with Sam Francis.
Tom, thank you very much and good evening to you. It's just coming up to 2 minutes past 8 and the US president is among world leaders congratulating Sir Keir Starmer on his election win. In a call with the new Prime Minister, Joe Biden said he looks forward to their shared work supporting freedom and democracy. Earlier, Sir Keir Starmer met with the King to accept the job of Prime Minister.
Sir Keir Starmer, Your Majesty. Your Majesty.
Well, during that historic meeting at Buckingham Palace, King Charles told the Labour leader he must be utterly exhausted as the King acknowledged the challenge of getting to grips with the role of Prime Minister. And meanwhile, some of Labour's new cabinet are starting to get to work. Wes Streeting, now Health Secretary, has promised to sit down with junior doctors in England next week to reach a deal and try to end their ongoing strike action. And the new Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, says he wants to see an immediate end to the ceasefire in the Israel-Gaza conflict. And the UK also now has its first ever female Chancellor, with Rachel Reeves taking on the role. She's described the appointment as a sign that there should be no limit to the ambition for women and girls. Earlier, she outlined her economic plans to staff at the Treasury, saying her central mission is to restore growth.
To deliver on this mission, I want to be the most pro-growth Treasury in our country's history. That'll mean doing what the Treasury does best, building growth on a rock of economic stability. But it also means taking on new challenges and new responsibilities to fix the foundations and to rebuild Britain.
And before appointing his new cabinet earlier, Sir Keir Starmer gave his first speech outside Downing Street, promising to rebuild trust in politics.
This wound, this lack of trust, can only be healed by actions, not words. I know that. But we can make a start today with the simple acknowledgement that public service is a privilege and that your government should treat every single person in this country with respect.
Sir Keir Starmer. Well, a recap then of the numbers. Labour's landslide of 412 seats has now left the Conservatives with just 121. The Conservatives are now, of course, looking to plan their next steps after Rishi Sunak announced he'll step down as leader following that worst ever election defeat for the Tories. The Liberal Democrats triumphed with 71 seats in a huge increase from their previous total of 11. The SNP left with 9 seats and the Greens on 2. Meanwhile, Reform UK have claimed their 5th seat after a recount in Basildon South and East Thurrock. James McMurdoch, a last-minute candidate, has won with a narrow majority of 98 votes over Labour's Jack Ferguson. Tonight's unexpected win for Reform, getting those 5 seats, comes just hours after Nigel Farage was heckled as he took to the stage at an event in London. Take a listen.
You're a ruling class fraud! Boring! Boring!
Well, the Reform leader was forced to delay that speech multiple times while staff removed various protesters, but joked that it was good preparation for his new role as an MP in the House of Commons. And just some other news away from the election for you. Former nurse Lucy Letby has protested her innocence after she was sentenced to another whole-life jail term today for trying to kill a baby girl. Earlier this week, she was convicted of the attempted murder of a premature baby at the Countess of Chester Hospital in 2016. The 34-year-old has already been found guilty of killing 7 babies and trying to kill 6 others at that neonatal unit between 2015 and 2016. And finally, before we hand back to Tom in Westminster, some sport for you. England manager Gareth Southgate says that it's common sense to allow Jude Bellingham to play in tomorrow's Euro 2024 quarter-finals. The midfielder is available for tomorrow's game against Switzerland following the result of a UEFA investigation into his conduct. He's been given a suspended one-game ban for a gesture that he made during the squad's win over Slovakia in their last 16 match. And in the last half hour, we've heard that the tournament's hosts and leading scorers, Germany, they have crashed out of Euro 2024. That's after their defeat against Spain, the tournament's favourites, losing 2-1. Those are the latest GB News headlines. For now, I'm Sam Francis, and I'll be back with you for another update at 9 o'clock.
For the very latest GB News direct to your smartphone, sign up to News Alerts by scanning the QR code or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
Good evening. Welcome back to You at Home, and indeed, welcome back to the Liberal Democrats. Gone as a major force in Parliament since 2015, but 9 years of hurt never stopped them dreaming. It was a record-breaking night as they returned 71 MPs, taking seats off two former Prime Minister's areas, neither of them were standing, of course, David Cameron and Theresa May. Now, was it Ed Davey's slapstick campaign that paid the dividends, or is this a case of intense tactical voting? Well, I'm delighted to be joined by my esteemed panel, Liberal Democrats Federal Board member Callum Robertson, former Labour advisor Matthew Larser and former aide to Margaret Thatcher Niall Gardner. Callum, was it the bungee what won it?
I think it certainly helped. We had a traditional problem of getting into the media. Why? Because we're not going to say the extreme things that Farage is saying, and we're not the Tories or Labour, so we don't get the automatic airtime. So we had to do stuff that is different in order to get heard. Now, we did. But actually, what's really crucial is that every single one of those stunts came with a really clear message. Whether it was going down the water slide and talking about the children's mental health crisis, or whether it is playing the drums in a old people's home and talking about the social care crisis, or whether
some of them were tenuous. Some of them were tenuous. I mean, here we have Ed Davey dangling by his feet over a crane somewhere in the southwest, saying, take a leap of faith, do something you've never done before, vote Liberal Democrat. I mean, yes, OK, you could make the argument it's connected, but it's tenuous.
We made the request to the public to take a leap of faith, and by God, they've responded. 71 seats, our best result since 1923.
It is, and yet it's one of your lowest shares of the vote. I think it's a slightly lower share than last time round when you got 11 seats.
Ever so slightly higher.
Ever so slightly higher. Very, very similar numbers, but of course far lower. I mean, we were talking about the Social Democratic Party in 1983 a little bit earlier in this programme. They got a quarter of the vote and fewer than 20 seats. Now, you've got 11.6% of the vote and 71 seats.
Yes. Which actually, if you're looking at how seats match votes, that's broadly in line.
Broadly proportional.
But actually, that's one of the few times first past the post has actually worked out for us. Now, our opposition to first past the post isn't actually sort of on basis whether it benefits us or not. It's really on the basis of a point of principle. Our vote should match seats. And yes, whilst it sort of happened to work out for us this time, first past the post, actually, who did it actually really cause issues for? It caused issues for reform. Now, we agree with reform on basically nothing, and we're not going to pretend we do. But what we do agree with them on, and what they agree with us on, is proportional representation. They got a very decent share of the vote. And actually, what do those voters do if they vote time and time again and they're not listened to? They go a more extreme angle. And that doesn't work for our entire nation, our political system. So actually, what is our priority for the next Parliament? Well, holding Labour to account, but also pushing for important changes like proportional representation.
Now, I'm surprised to see Matthew Larser nodding here, because your party, Matthew, has just won an enormous victory on a disproportional system.
Absolutely. I mean, look, and, I personally am a supporter of fairer votes, not necessarily the system that, a totally proportional system, but, we're probably not going to destroy everybody's Friday night by going to different systems.
Yeah, if I hear
letters STV, I'm going to
absolutely
leave.
But sort of
we will.
keeping the constituency link, but giving a preference within constituencies. And actually, oddly, I think you might have seen a result. It might have been a different split between the progressive parties, but you might have seen actually still a broad progressive result. So I think, look, you cannot ignore people who voted reform now over a sustained period of time and don't feel they're getting representation.
Now, Niall, you of course worked for Margaret Thatcher after she left office. Arguably, what some psephologists say, not all, of course, but what some say is that she was helped in her time in power because there was this split on the left. There was the SDP, there was the Liberals, there was the Labour Party all taking votes and perhaps helping the Conservatives in some seats. Do you think that's true?
Well, I think that right now, if you look at the Labour Party and the Liberals, they're very, very similar, of course, ideologically. And so you nearly have 500 MPs who are sort of progressive, figures of the left, basically. And I do think this is actually a dangerous scenario for the United Kingdom. It's nearly a sort of one-party state. But we're not going to see, I think, proportional representation being brought in, as unfair as it is to Reform, who only received, have 5 MPs receiving 4 million votes.
Because their vote was so sort of spread around the country, they didn't know where their vote was. Obviously, that happened with the Lib Dems for years and years and years and years. But what the Lib Dems did was they found out where their vote was, and then they intensified their campaigns, targeted in the seats that matter. Now that Reform have almost 100 second-place finishes, they know where they can put their resources. Next time round, they'll probably have a much better result.
Right. Yeah, I do think actually Reform are going to be a strong force in the coming years. And the surge in support for Reform, nearly 15% of the vote, is an incredible achievement, considering this is a very, very new party. And if you put Reform in Europe, for example, any European country, they'd have a very large number of seats. But I don't believe that Britain is going to be at any stage in the coming decade moving towards proportional representation. Also, PR leads to a lot of political instability, as we see in so many European countries. And I do think first past the post is the most effective system for the UK, and I don't think that's going to change.
Ultimately, do you think this is a bit of a moot point? Because there's no way the Labour Party in the next 5 years is going to make electoral reform a sort of priority. I think people would be a bit confused if they did. People have bread and butter issues they want to pursue. The cost of living, migration, the health service, all these big issues of the election campaign. Is talking about proportional representation just a bit too political? Politicos talking to each other and all saying sort of random initialisms and acronyms that no one else understands?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, it's not going to happen in the UK. And as we see in Europe, I think the system leads to a large number of coalition governments, all sorts of political turmoil. I don't think it works effectively at all.
And yet, Callum, you might argue that the coalition government was fairly stable?
Yeah, it certainly rescued the economy when it was in sort of a Labour-induced downward spiral.
Globally induced, Cameron. Global financial crisis.
Let's split the difference. Globally induced, Labour exacerbated. No, I think this is a funny point, and we shouldn't dwell on it. But of course, there were outside factors that led to the Labour Party's defeat in 2010, just as there were outside factors in terms of the global rise in interest rates that have been blamed on the Conservatives here. I think there are many parallels we can draw between what's happened over the last 24 hours and what happened in 2010.
I do think, Niall, actually, you make a fair point about actually some really important issues that matter to people. We're still in a cost of living crisis. We've still got record levels of child poverty, and we've got a health and social care crisis that is a ticking time bomb for our nation. Our hospitals can't take any more. We haven't got any beds left for people. These are issues that Labour have got a plan for. Is it the most effective plan? I'm not sure it is going to be the most effective plan. I think Ed Davies' health and social plan that was widely lauded would be potentially a better option. So I think the next 5 years are not necessarily about constitutional issues, but actually really about holding Labour's feet to the fire and making them a government that is genuinely, as Keir Starmer wants, in service of the people.
Well, there we go. We're going to have to leave that there because coming up, Reform's biggest donor is joining us to discuss that Reform campaign and where the party goes from here. Don't go anywhere. See you in 3 minutes.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Your lunchtime update on the stories that matter across the UK.
From breaking news and insightful analysis, inspiring stories and lively debates. You're comparing yourself to a former Prime Minister.
Which is it?
Stay informed, stay updated, stay entertained.
I just don't know how anyone would not want to be there.
Every weekday from midday.
We are Good Afternoon Britain, only on GB News.
Britain's news channel.
Mark Dolan Tonight. Weekends from 9 p.m.
As he turns 80 next month, Thomas Markle gives a moving interview to the Mail newspaper saying, "I've never been one for birthdays, but I know the one person I most want to hear from, Meghan, will not be in touch. I'd love to meet my grandchildren," he said, "but I'd be happy with a photograph at this stage." Well, for reaction to this sad story, I'm delighted to welcome US political and royal commentator Hilary Fordwich.
He also added that he never thought that he'd have something in common with the king. And of course, the king doesn't know his grandchildren either. And I think that's a very sad state of affairs. What is very important, the important thread here, though, is the hypocrisy. The hypocrisy of Meghan Markle claiming to care about people and all the tours they go on where they have empathy for people, and yet her very own father. And also, Mark, it really happened so fast. In 2016, she posted on Instagram that her daddy was the greatest in the world. And the other thing is that she claimed that she had made everything herself and she came from a very poor family. Actually, she had a very privileged childhood, being sent to private schools in California.
Well, poor old Thomas Markle, as he approaches his 80th birthday, is a serious thorn in the side and, frankly, an ongoing embarrassment to the couple.
Yes, and I think that one of the things that's immensely sad is that, Meghan Markle wasn't happy to be number 2 to Princess Catherine, and now she ends up being really nothing. I do think that a tiger doesn't change its stripes. What we have to look at here is track record. Somebody who's dumped her friends, dumped her own family, dumped her country originally when she came over to the UK, and even her adopted dog. There is a track record there, and Thomas Markle has sadly said it's referred to now as being Markled when you're dumped.
GB News, the People's Channel.
Hi there, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm going to take a second to tell you all about my show, Dubes & Co. We start off with the issues of the day. We then bring in both sides of the arguments. We get rid of the disrespect, and then you throw me into the mix. And trust me, I'll tell it exactly how it is. And then, of course, the magic ingredient, you at home. We mix it all together, and what have we got? In my opinion, the best debate show in town. Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Good evening, it's 18 minutes past 8 and the election coverage has been dominated by one issue perhaps above many others, the surge in support for reform. Yes, the Reform Party received more than 14% of votes and currently has 5 members of Parliament now after James McMurdoch was confirmed as the surprise Member of Parliament for South Basildon and East Thurrock just a little bit earlier this evening. Now, Reform came second in a staggering 98 seats and has promised to professionalise the party and move the fight on to a new Labour government. So, what was behind the rise in Reform and what happens now? I'm delighted to be joined by Reform UK's biggest donor, Zia Yusuf. And Zia, this is perhaps on the upper end of expectations from many journalists, at least, of where people were thinking Reform could come. Most people I was speaking to were saying 1, maybe 2 seats, and now you have 5.
Mm-hmm. Well, look, we shouldn't forget that October 2022, Reform are polling at around 4%. As of around 4.5 weeks ago, Nigel Farage was not even standing. So when we think about what has just happened in terms of momentum, astonishing. Reform have just delivered 14% of the vote share on a shoestring budget, having only been led by Nigel, the generational political talent, for about four and a little bit weeks, having had a mainstream media that has been pretty openly hostile against them, and no national infrastructure, right? All of those, well, maybe one won't change in the near future, but the rest of those, I can assure you, going to change. As we speak, the party is professionalising, it is building a national infrastructure.
I would put it to you that actually Reform has had a bit of a lucky escape by only electing these 5 MPs. Because as Nigel Farage admitted himself, there were lots of candidates who the party didn't really know who they were, and it caused the party a lot of trouble, particularly in the last 2 weeks of the campaign. Had Reform done a little bit better and elected perhaps 20 MPs, you couldn't be sure who these people were. Perhaps that would make it very, very difficult to control a group in Parliament.
I wouldn't go so far as to say necessarily that we wouldn't have known who they were. But I take the point that, look, I can assure you what is going to be very clear, the next roster of candidates that we put forward, the candidates that we put forward in the inevitable by-elections that are going to be coming up are going to be truly exceptional. We're going to have a first-class vetting process, again, as we speak, that is being stood up. So we would absolutely have a much higher degree of confidence in the quality of those candidates, yeah.
And yet you're going to have a mighty battle, not just with the Labour Party, but with the Conservative Party for sort of the soul of the centre-right in the United Kingdom. The Conservative Party will be able to point to, and are pointing to, more than 100 seats where the difference between the Tory and the Labour vote share was more than eclipsed by the Reform vote share.
Mm-hmm. Look, I think that's a very easy thing for the Conservatives to point to. I will just tell you there's data to back this up, and all of the anecdotes on the doorsteps is the notion that Reform voters would have voted for the Tories if the Reform wasn't there is a fantasy. It's a complete and utter fantasy, right? There's one party that is responsible for Labour being in power. There is one party that is responsible for the total repudiation that the Conservatives have received at this election. It is the Conservative Party. Even if Nigel hadn't stood, even if Reform had stood out all of its candidates, Labour would have won a significant majority.
Hang on, the Labour Party won 33.8% of the vote. Mm-hmm. When we were discussing whether or not the Reform Party will actually make the difference between we were talking about the Labour Party on 44% of the vote. They underperformed by double digits. I mean, this could have been a lot closer election. This could have been a very big surprise of an election. I mean, the polls were out by 10 points.
Mm-hmm. So the assumption you're making is you're looking at the national vote share and thinking that that translates into seats. I've been listening to the programme thus far. Clearly, that is not the case. The data does actually show, if you actually look at it forensically, seat by seat, you cannot make the argument credibly that if Reform didn't exist, the Tories would have won a majority. It's just not true. To that point, however, look, we are in a situation where I was just reading, this is, I think, the second most disproportionate result of any advanced democracy in history. When you look at, for example, 33.7% vote share for Labour, 63% of the seats. Reform, 14.3% of the votes, 0.5%.
Almost
of
a million votes per seat.
Almost a million. Now, the good news, I want to be really clear, we're not walking around whinging here. We think, like, we will elect Nigel Farage as Prime Minister in 2029 under a first-past-the-post system. We are not making an assumption that we will have PR, even if PR might be a good thing. It'll be tough to make that happen. Secondly, the reality is that the Conservative Party, as you said, is... I don't think the Conservative Party, as somebody who was a member of the Conservative Party, I don't think the Conservative Party as we know it exists anymore. I don't think it knows, it clearly doesn't even know who its next leader is going to be. And look at the people who are putting their hats into the ring. They essentially should be in different parties. They share almost no political philosophy. We have a generational, once-in-a-lifetime political talent around whom we can unite. You know exactly where he stands. There's absolutely unity. And that is actually, as someone who built a startup, so I actually know the advantages that you can have over a big incumbent. You get to build your team step by step. And every single person joining that team, and by that team I mean members, I mean prospective voters, as well as obviously the staff and the candidates, they know exactly what they are signing up for. And they are very excited about Nigel essentially delivering all of the things that we know we need to deliver to return Britain to its greatness.
Now, you've burst personally onto the political scene in this country in a way perhaps we haven't seen before in such a rapid timescale. What made you decide to sort of become a public spokesperson for this party, and can we expect you to stand in one of these by-elections that comes up in the next year or two?
Well, look, my motivations are that I love my country. I've started a business, I sold it last year, and I could see the direction that this country was going in, and I'm also convinced about what an incredible future this country can have. I feel like we're at a real inflection point for the country. When Nigel said he wasn't standing, I must confess I was pretty despondent, borderline depressed, and when he said that he was going to stand, I felt like this was the moment, and if I didn't do it, I would regret it for the rest of my life. And I said to Nigel, I will help you, yes, with some money, but in any way, shape or form that I can. And that's what I'm doing.
Well, where Nigel might need a bit more help is in making sure that the right people are invited into certain rooms and that there perhaps is a bit more security. Let's take a look at this.
Are you downwind of a couple already? You've had a bigger lunch than I've had. God, he must be screaming. He's absolutely steaming. I decided that I would not. Boring. I'm enjoying this. Any more for any more?
Actually, yes. Oh, I mean, you can't help but laugh. But Zia, I mean, it's not the most professional start to Nigel Farage's parliamentary career.
Well, look, what we just saw there, the people responsible for that were the overgrown infants who resort to shouting, ad hominem attacks generally at Nigel. And what they don't realise they're doing, or maybe they do, is essentially they are casting aspersions on almost a fifth of the country now, right? And I can tell you, we've seen this in America. We're seeing it increasingly here. I've been really, really surprised as a voter myself, just how popular and how people, particularly on the left, seem to think it is a sensible, useful strategy to sneer at voters, to make fun of them for really actually legitimate concerns, right? I mean, Nigel, again, I know Nigel very well personally. He is none of those things. And I think the more people see of him, the more that they realise that. You could see at our rally in Birmingham, 5,000 odd people of all different backgrounds, young and old. Obviously, I was one of the speakers. This is a party which has got a very positive message of hope for this country. And, that kind of behaviour, look, we can laugh about it. I actually think it's entirely counterproductive for the people who advocate for it.
Goodness me, well, 14% of the vote. I'm going to ask my panel now, do we think that the Reform Party vote share is going to be higher or lower in 4 or 5 years' time at the next election? Callum, we're going to start with you.
Let's look back to 2015. 14% is roughly what UKIP got in 2015. That actually portion of the vote hasn't actually shifted that much. We're talking about Reform Surge. The Reform Surge it's just happened to be managed slightly better under the first past the post system. We're not talking about something that actually really exists.
OK, Matthew?
Massively. If we want a second term of a Labour government, which I do, then it needs to be lower, and therefore Labour needs to listen to the concerns of Reform voters and make sure that it in no way dismisses those concerns.
And Niall?
Well, if the Conservatives continue down the path that they have been taking with Wets in command, really, of the party, then Reform's vote is going to significantly rise. Now, if the Conservatives move to the right and you have a leader such as Suella Braverman or Priti Patel, for example, I do think that that poses a challenge to Reform in terms of the number of votes that they can get. I expect that some Reform voters will move back to the Conservatives, but if you see more of the kind of Sunak-Cameron type of leadership, that's a huge problem for the Conservatives, and Reform will build and build.
It's interesting, Zia, just to round this conversation off, do you think the Conservative leadership contest, the shape of the Conservative Party, as it will be decided over the coming weeks and months, will have a material impact on whether or not these two parties can work together, create some sort of pact? Of course, there was the famous alliance in the 1980s between the SDP and the Liberals. Could that be something that the Reform Party would look at as a possibility?
Well, Nigel's been clear about this. That's not a club that he would want to join. We have all the momentum right now. Look, if we look at, even if you take Labour, who obviously are celebrating today, lower vote share, lower absolute number of votes than they got under Jeremy Corbyn. Obviously, the Conservatives have been annihilated. The Lib Dems haven't really made material progress. We are not only the ones with momentum, we have momentum going up pretty much in a straight line over a short period of time. If you look at what's happened in France, and Nigel Farage is not Marine Le Pen by any means. However, you look at just what's happened in terms of shifting of votes. Marine Le Pen has gone from 18 to 36% of the vote share inside 2 years. Again, an unprecedented move in terms of French politics. We live in a new era now. I hear a lot of people talking on political TV shows talking about how it's going to take decades. Again, as a startup person, as someone who's built a technology company, we live in a different era. And the total failure to understand the momentum that reform have and the potential that we have, I think, is really interesting. So to answer your question directly, we're focused on continuing to build the Reform Party. And look, I don't even think the Conservatives, you're talking about a leadership process. They don't even know what the leadership process is. You know, they're talking about removing the right of Conservative members to even vote on their leaders, lest that they vote for the people that the MPs don't want. So I think, frankly, the Conservative Party is going to continue to be in a very difficult position for the foreseeable, and we're going to continue our momentum.
Goodness me. Well, Zia Youssef, thank you so much for talking through those big issues. And I do have to say, it does chime, this idea that voters are much more, well, the word that psephologists keep using and have used over the last 24 hours is promiscuous. A much more promiscuous electorate than at any time before. I'm not sure if that's an appropriate word to be using, but you know what? Political scientists got to get their kicks somewhere. Well, thanks so much to Zia Youssef and my panel. Coming up, we'll be joined by a former Labour advisor to discuss Sir Keir Starmer's first cabinet appointments and what to expect in his first 100 days in charge. Don't go anywhere.
Hello, very good evening to you. Here's your latest GB News weather forecast coming to you from the Met Office. This weekend's looking relatively cool and showery for many of us, but before then we do have some heavy persistent rain around. Today we've had a waving front across southern parts bringing some wet weather here, and then a pulse of heavy persistent rain is pushing its way northeastwards across England as we go through this evening and overnight, clearing through though as we go through the early hours of tomorrow morning. That being said, there will be some heavy persistent rain lingering across northern parts of Scotland, which could cause some localised issues. Elsewhere, some showery rain, but also some clear skies, under which, away from the towns and cities, we're likely to dip into single figures. So a bit of a fresh start for the time of year. If we look in more detail, and as I mentioned, there will be some heavy persistent rain across some northern parts of Scotland. We could see some high totals building up, chance of a bit of flooding and some difficult driving conditions here. Heading further south though, and there will be some showers perhaps across parts of Northern Ireland and into northern England too. Watch out for some heavy showery rain affecting more central parts of England and into Wales too, and then across more southern parts of England we're likely to have just a mixture of sunny spells and a few scattered showers around. As we go through the day, some of the heavier, more frequent showery rain should clear away of sorts, but there will be plenty of showers around as we go through the afternoon, particularly towards the north and west. Further south and east, perhaps a greater chance of seeing something a little bit drier, but even here, 1 or 2 showers are possible. There will be some blustery winds around, and with temperatures below average for the time of year, it is going to feel relatively cool for most of us. Overnight, the showers should largely die out, so Sunday is actually likely to start mostly dry for many places, but quite quickly we're going to see a rash of showers developing, many of us likely to catch some showers, and they could be heavy, possibly even thundery at times too, and temperatures still on the low side for the time of year. Monday at the moment looks largely dry before more wet weather arrives later on. Bye-bye.
Weekdays on GB News. Wake up to breakfast every day from 6 a.m. Followed by Britain's newsroom at 9:30. At noon, it's Good Afternoon Britain. Followed by Martin Daubney from 3 p.m. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Nana Akwe, for an informative, interactive news programme with a difference. It's fun.
It's true. You're not wrong. No one will be cancelled.
Lovely. Join me from 3 p.m. every weekend, only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Neil Oliver, every Sunday night at 6 p.m. on GB News. And if an hour is not nearly enough for you, go to gbnews.com for special extended episodes online every Friday at 9 p.m, where we can truly get into the nitty-gritty of what's going on. GB News, Britain's news channel.
Good evening, it's 34 minutes past 8 and time now to look ahead to what our new government has in store. What does it look like? What will the first 100 days of this government consist of? And what should we make of Sir Keir Starmer's first cabinet? Well, as we have the headline names, the transfers have mainly been done. Delighted to be joined by former Labour advisor James Mathewson. And James, perhaps the most surprising thing about this first cabinet of Sir Keir Starmer is just how little change there is.
Yeah, quite confident, isn't it, to say, well, we've got everyone in the right place, we've got everyone where they need to be.
But I think this shows you the level of detail that's been put into the strategy for the Labour Party and their preparations for government. If these people are in the departments that they are going to be running, they have been for some time, which most of them have been, then you can guess that they're going to have quite extensive preparations for those government departments, which of course they will now walk into, which is our strange political system, isn't it? They're just going to wander into these departments that are already undertaking huge projects and huge amounts of work, and they're going to change the direction of them overnight.
Now, one of the changes, and there are very few changes, but Emily Thornberry doesn't appear to have been given a position in the shadow cabinet, at least not at this stage. The position of Attorney General is going to someone who's not in politics at all, presumably about to be made a member of the House of Lords. Why do you think it is that Emily Thornberry's been excluded?
I think Emily Thornberry is a key Labour figure, and I mean, whether there's been anything behind the scenes, I haven't heard anything, and I would have thought I would hear something. I mean, the Labour Party never tends to argue in quiet like the Tories do. You know, they tend to do it in public. So we would have heard if there was some kind of bad blood between them. I imagine there's some appointment for Emily. There is something down the line, or there's some important role for her in this government that is yet to be revealed. The Attorney General, of course, is a huge position, a very important position, and Emily has a huge amount of legal and judiciary experience as a barrister. But I'm amazed by that, to be honest, because I thought she was a great appointment. But she is very clued up on different departments and the diversity of government as well. So I'm sure there's many places that could put her.
Yes, I suppose maybe it had something to do with the fact that one of the only gaffes that the Labour Party had in this campaign was when Emily Thornberry said on GB News that she wouldn't mind state school class sizes rising in the short term as a result of higher taxes on private schools. I wonder if sort of that media split might... Am I reading too much into that?
I think you're hopeful, Tom, that a gap like that took place on your network, because that would be tremendous, wouldn't it? If that happened, and that
it received quite a lot of coverage. It was the wonderful Camilla Tominey conducting the interview, rather than I'm not blowing my own trumpet. But of course we did see two surprises. Well, more than two surprises, but my goodness, two Labour shadow cabinet surprises. Thangam Debonair, the shadow culture secretary, losing her seat to the Greens, and Jonathan Ashworth, the shadow paymaster general, losing his seat to a pro-Gaza independent candidate. I mean, very few people saw that coming.
Yeah, real shame, I think, to be honest. There isn't anybody in the Labour movement, the trade union movement, the Labour Party itself, who isn't fond of Jonathan Ashworth. Many people have met him, and he's done some really important work. I know lots of Tories who like him because he did a lot of crossbench work on alcoholism, for example, was very open about the alcoholism of his father. So he's been a very prominent member of Parliament, a very prominent senior Labour figure. So that's a real shame. And like you say, a real shock as well. Also gives the party a good warning that this is possible. It is possible for issues like Gaza to really affect the chances. And of course, it hasn't damaged the electoral fortunes of them. But to lose somebody like Jonathan, who was, former Shadow Health Minister, Secretary of State, potentially for the health department, and that's like Labour's crown and jewel, really, as positions go, to look after the NHS. Jonathan's a real person. Thangam as well, another star of the Labour movement. So I think they'll be sorely missed.
And potentially focusing too much on the results that actually happened, we're missing a deeper story here. There could have been many, many more Labour scalps that came within a hair's breadth of actually losing. Wes Streeting, 500 votes away from losing his seat. His seat had a 5-figure majority last election. That was an extraordinary shock. And Jess Phillips too. These were both to pro-Gaza independent candidates. Two of the biggest names in the Labour Party very nearly lost their seats.
Yeah, exactly. And it just goes to show, and those people who've been dismissive in the party, that one issue can affect things, so significantly. It can. And you know what it is? People are really, really angry about the situation in Gaza with the Labour Party. They're angry at every political party, the Tories and Labour, because they haven't seen action, or what they consider to be enough action. And whether you think people know the details or understand the ins and outs of the complex foreign policy of it. What matters to people is they've seen children dying en masse, and they've seen horrific scenes coming out of Gaza, and it has moved them to a point where they've said, actually,
there is a concern, though, that this is a sectarian vote, that these are candidates from one particular ethnicity campaigning towards one particular ethnicity, often with campaign material that's not written in English and seems very divided, very separate, very in the mould of George Galloway.
Yeah, of course there are ways to divide communities. There always is in Britain. And where there are different ethnic communities, there is always going to be a wedge that you can drive between them. However, I would say I think that the opportunism of this and the politicians who drive these wedges is entirely self-motivated. I don't think it's communities against communities. I think it's some opportunistic politicians or would-be politicians trying to drive a wedge between those communities and trying to worsen the divisions. I don't think those divisions are naturally occurring or organic. And I think really we are very lucky in this country that you take somewhere like America, for example, we don't have those boiling tensions on a regular basis between different communities, and we should be very proud of that. But there are always politicians who will seek to divide.
No, there always will be. It'll be a fascinating one to watch. Where might this next pop up? But for now, James Mathewson, former Labour advisor, really appreciate your time this evening. Now, we're going to round off with something really quite remarkable because, of course, it's been a campaign like no other. Right from the off, with Rishi Sunak's failure to bring a brolly to Sir Ed Davey's bungee jump, we're going to be looking back at the highlights of this. Yes, there were some highlights. We're going to be looking at the highlights of this campaign after this.
Are the newspapers getting you down?
My wife didn't divorce me that month.
Struggling to separate the wheat from the chaff?
I know that it's a bit of a circus at the best of times.
Well, don't worry. Headliners has got you covered. We'll take the burden of reading the day's news, and if we get depressed, who cares? It's an occupational hazard, frankly. That's Headliners on GB News from 11 p.m. till midnight, and the following morning, 5 till 6 a.m. on GB News, the comedy channel. Nah, just kidding. Britain's news channel.
Martin Daubney, weekdays from 3 p.m.
How deep is the rift between Prince William and Prince Harry? Well, it's been reported that Prince William is refusing to speak to Prince Harry and has even taken on the role of disciplinarian, which was once, of course, the job of Prince Philip. But has that job gone now to William? And does he indeed rule with a rod of iron? Well, joining me now to discuss this is the former BBC Royal correspondent Michael Cole. Himself has a lot of iron. Do you think this is a fair approximation of the character? After all, Michael Cole, surely the palace could do with a firm leader at the moment. Is Wills the man?
I think he is, Martin, and good afternoon to you. William, 42 last Friday. He's grown into the role of heir apparent. He looks good, he sounds good. Now, when the late Queen was alive, she was the chairman of the board, but the chief executive was definitely Prince Philip. She was the head of state, but he was the head of the family. He chaired the Way Ahead Committee. He liaised with the security services. And he laid down the law for a long, long time. Of course, Duchess of York, Sarah Fergie, was banished. And he also used to go through the invitation lists for any royal event, striking off people he didn't want there. So he was very much in charge. And I think the situation with William is that when he makes up his mind is made up. And he's doing extraordinarily well. And he's doing it without the daily support in public of his wife, of course. And we all wish Kate, the Princess of Wales, well and a speedy continued recovery. And I think the King will be welcoming his older son taking this more prominent role because, quite frankly, he can't do everything.
GB News, the People's Channel.
I'm Patrick Christie's. Every weeknight from 9, I bring you 2 hours of unmissable, explosive debate and headline-grabbing interviews. What impact has that had?
We got death threats and the bomb threat and so on.
As time passes,
she could have said Storm. You made my argument for me. My guest and I tackle the issues that really matter with a sharp take on every story.
Went everywhere.
Something practical could be done.
Or I can become something different. Patrick Christie's tonight from 9 p.m. only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Well, 6 weeks of campaigning is mercifully over. Rishi Sunak's surprise election announcement in the rain was a sign of what was to come for the Conservative Party. The headlines indeed wrote themselves. Downing Street. Labour's campaign was steady, quite dull, but it was more about retaining support and not making any big mistakes. And it's hard to think about the campaign without thinking, of course, about Sir Ed Davey. The leader of the Lib Dems got through swimming trunks faster than Tom Daley. Well, joining us to look back at the highs and lows of the campaign is the former Conservative MP, Jerry Hayes. My panel is still with me too. Jerry, if you could pick a highlight, and I know it's difficult, I know that many people have complained bitterly about this campaign. What was your best bit?
The best bit was listening to Rishi Sunak and listening to the new Prime Minister being nice about each other. Of being decent and being proper and having a handover of power without difficulty, without saying we've been robbed, this is fake news, we've got tanks on the lawn of the House of Commons. A lesson to Donald Trump.
A low bar indeed. I suppose, Matthew, is there anything that sticks out that you will remember more than most from this campaign?
I think it's very difficult because Labour's entire strategy was about not having a single moment that stood out. This so-called Ming Vase strategy of carrying the Ming Vase without dropping it across the finishing line. I want to smash the Ming Vase today. I never want to have that metaphor used again. So I think Labour's kind of standout moment was not having any standout moments.
I think that is perhaps the most interesting view of this all, because ultimately, Niall, the Conservative Prime Minister tried to seize the initiative. The first week of the campaign, there was a new policy every day, the Triple Lock Plus, national service. He came out with loads of new ideas, but ultimately no one was really listening.
Yeah, it didn't work. I think, firstly, the call for an early election was a huge mistake by Sunak. I think, secondly, once Nigel Farage entered the race as leader of Reform, he dominated the news, and tremendous energy, of course, with Nigel, completely overshadowing everything the Conservatives said. And Reform, at the end of the day, ran a highly effective campaign. The Conservatives did not. And I think it will go down in history as one of the worst-run political campaigns. And a capital, I think, Rishi Sunak, he's really been a very weak-kneed leader for the Conservatives, and the Conservatives need a far stronger leader in the years ahead if they're going to be successful.
Niall, in the 1980s, of course, Conservatives were divided into wets and dries.
Yes.
I suppose the visual metaphors write themselves.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Rishi Sunak started off the campaign as a wet. I think that most of his premiership, he came across...
that is the most dreadful
He came across
nonsense.
as a very, very wet Prime Minister.
Some of us actually properly worked with Margaret. I listened to you for years.
This was a catastrophe.
Some of us actually worked with Margaret Thatcher for many, many years, and some of us actually advised her in 1975. She was one of the most compromising people you could possibly imagine, and she would be turning in her grave. There's some of the nonsense that you come out with.
That's absolutely ridiculous, right? I mean, you're calling Margaret Thatcher a compromiser?
Yes, because I was with her.
That is completely
you weren't. You were some kid who made her tea.
Goodness me.
Ridiculous.
I'm going to jump in here and perhaps suggest that Margaret Thatcher in 1979 might have been different from Margaret Thatcher in the late 1980s.
I worked recently for Margaret Thatcher. In contrast, I mean, you knew her maybe many, many decades ago.
I worked with her when she was Prime Minister.
She would not have been impressed in any way with Rishi Sunak's performance.
No, neither was I.
She would have condemned the state of the Conservative Party today. She would have been horrified by it.
And who would she be condemned of most of all? Boris Johnson and Liz Truss. She would never have them in her party. You would have known that.
No, that's actually not true at all.
Really? Margaret Thatcher
ridiculous.
would have had someone as dishonest as Boris Johnson and her party.
Boris Johnson won a huge election victory in 2019. He delivered Brexit.
Save me from this.
You should be grateful, frankly. If Boris Johnson was the leader of the Conservative Party,
we'd have won, of course, with an overwhelming overwhelming
been in the
majority.
mess it's in.
And I feel like been
You're a months of political discussion will be precisely this.
Yes.
This is the Conservative Party ripping itself apart.
Exactly right, Tom.
And how is that avoidable at all, or will the Conservative Party descend into this Margaret Thatcher, Boris Johnson, David Cameron, Liz Truss, Rishi Sunak,
Churchill?
Why not?
Churchill.
Oh, let's throw Disraeli in there as well.
Why not? But the fact is, the Tory party has got to heal. What is the purpose of the Tory party? The Tory party is there for gaining power. And
It's there to advance conservative ideas, principles and policies. Actually.
Which is what?
That's the purpose.
Oh, gosh, you're
of the
going to tell me
Conservative
that
Party,
someone is a true conservative. Oh, no, I think I'm going to be violently sick.
Well, here we have the debate that I'm sure will be... Why don't we bring in Callum Robertson for some light relief? Because, of course... Because, of course, your party leader potentially spent more time on various roller coasters and water slides.
We got 71 seats
than he did speaking about these deep ideological differences.
Yeah, we had a fun campaign. We had a good campaign. My highlight, I'm afraid I'm going to have to be ever so slightly boring here. I've got a friend, Tom Gordon, who just got elected last night as the MP for Harrogate and Knaresborough. Tom, he's very open about this. He grew up on free school meals. He is a genuine working class lad who's worked really hard and overcome everything to get into Parliament with a stonking majority. My highlight of the night was seeing him up there. And actually, my highlight of the next 5 years, we're seeing people like him making a really positive difference to public life.
And Jonathan Ashworth, who we were talking about earlier, who you might expect, mate, but he's, as James was saying, his parents met in a Playboy club. His dad was a croupier. His mum was a bunny girl. He grew up on free school meals. It's a sad loss to the neighbours because of having that diversity of voices. I'm just going to chuck in another highlight, if I may, which is in a spirit of bipartisanship, was I thought the Ed Davey party political broadcast, where he told his story, talked about his son, but also was talking about his parents and everything, and the tragedies he's faced with, the trauma he's faced. I thought it was very moving. When you heard about it, it sounded it could be a bit saccharine. When you watched it, I thought it was incredibly moving.
Yeah, I think that was actually something very unique and actually, do you know what it reminded me of? I think there was a video made about Neil Kinnock.
Yes, Kinnock the movie. Kinnock the movie. Directed by Hugh Hudson, who directed Chariots of Fire, produced by David Putnam, and it was because this is in the days before social media, where people only 4 channels, people couldn't get off it. It so transformed. I mean, it stopped Labour. It so kept Labour in second place, but they didn't. They showed it again. They repeated it. First time ever.
Yes.
So Kinnock the movie, these sort of personal insights.
John Major the movie too. Do you remember? Going back to Brick Lane, going back
it's still there.
It's still
there. A Nick Clegg video somewhere of him doing a dance to a Carly Rae Jepsen film that I don't want to see. Refuses to release.
Yes, I have heard of this.
Of this parish, Gloria De Piero, who you sat next to many times, and I, when we've had a late evening and the early hours approach, we put on Kinnock the movie and we know every single word of it. It's there on YouTube. And then we text the Kinnock children saying we're watching
Neil Kinnock was a star. He got me out of a scrape. Years ago, I was doing a speaking engagement with him and Michael Heseltine, and we had a 3-line whip at 10 o'clock. Neil looked at me. I won't use the language he uses. His Boyle, you come with me. You're in trouble. Come in the leader of the opposition's car. And look the whips in the eyes and call them, see you next Tuesday. I will sort you out. Oh, yeah. And he rang up the chief whip and says, Jerry was with me. Good man.
Goodness me, so your bacon was saved.
My bacon was saved.
By your political opponent. We're learning it all tonight, ladies and gentlemen. I suppose we should look to the future, just to round off, because we've seen a bit of a taste of what might happen within conservatism. I'm being told we only have a number of seconds left, actually. So a final word from each on the panel. What is the next 6 months going to look like? Niall.
Well, firstly, if the Conservative Party chuck the wets out of the leadership and return to being a proper Conservative Party.
Labour absolutely relentlessly focused on delivery because they're not going to forget that percentage, even as they enjoy the seat lead.
Jerry.
Nigel Farage, clown car.
And Callum.
71 Liberal Democrats standing up for their communities because someone has
you're being so boring. Well, thank you so much, gentlemen. It's been an absolutely marvellous 2-hour extravaganza looking back on what has been an extraordinary general election campaign. So much more to come, though, and looking ahead, it's Patrick Christie's Tonight. But first, the weather.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello, very good evening to you. Here's your latest GB News weather forecast coming to you from the Met Office. This weekend's looking relatively cool and showery for many of us, but before then we do have some heavy persistent rain around. Today we've had a waving front across southern parts bringing some wet weather here, and then a pulse of heavy persistent rain is pushing its way northeastwards across England as we go through this evening and overnight, clearing through though as we go through the early hours of tomorrow morning. That being said, there will be some heavy persistent rain lingering across northern parts of Scotland, which could cause some localised issues. Elsewhere, some showery rain, but also some clear skies, under which, away from the towns and cities, we're likely to dip into single figures. So a bit of a fresh start for the time of year. If we look in more detail, and as I mentioned, there will be some heavy persistent rain across some northern parts of Scotland. We could see some high totals building up, chance of a bit of flooding and some difficult driving conditions here. Heading further south though, and there will be some showers, perhaps across parts of Northern Ireland and into northern England too. Watch out for some heavy showery rain affecting more central parts of England and into Wales too, and then across more southern parts of England we're likely to have just a mixture of sunny spells and a few scattered showers around. As we go through the day, some of the heavier, more frequent showery rain should clear away of sorts, but there will be plenty of showers around as we go through the afternoon, particularly towards the north and west. Further south and east, perhaps a greater chance of seeing something a little bit drier, but even here, 1 or 2 showers are possible. There will be some blustery winds around, and with temperatures below average for the time of year, it is going to feel relatively cool for most of us. Overnight, the showers should largely die out, so Sunday is actually likely to start mostly dry for many places, but quite quickly we're going to see a rash of showers developing, many of us likely to catch some showers, and they could be heavy, possibly even thundery at times too, and temperatures still on the low side for the time of year. Monday at the moment looks largely dry before more wet weather arrives later on. Bye-bye.
That warm feeling inside from Boxed Boilers.
It's our summer treat to you. Your chance to win an incredible £30,000 in tax-free cash. Our biggest cash prize of the year so far. With an extra £30,000 in your bank account this year, you could take the ultimate financial holiday and send some of those day-to-day financial stresses packing. £30,000 could get you those nagging home improvements done, buy that brand new car, or just enable you to kick back and relax for the rest of the year. For a chance to win £30,000 in tax-free cash, text CASH to 63232. Text costs £2 plus 1 standard network rate message. You can enter online at gbnews.com/win. Entries cost £2, or post your name and number to GB07 PO Box 8690 Derby DE1 9TT. UK only. Entrance must be 18 or over. Lines close at 5 p.m. on the 30th of August. Please check the closing time if listening or watching on demand. Good luck.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens.
With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK,
GB News brings you accurate reporting of the day's topical agenda.
When the news breaks, wherever and whenever it's happening,
we'll be there.
This is GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
If you want your news to be straight talking,
this is a nightmare for the Conservatives again.
Down to earth.
It's not just Nottingham where this is happening, is it?
And most importantly, honest.
Hard-working, middle-class taxpayers, they'll get the book thrown at them.
Then catch me, Martin Daubney, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
We're proud to be GB News, the People's Channel, and as you know, we always love to hear your views. Now, there's a new way of getting in touch with us at gbnews.com/yoursay. By commenting, you can be part of a live conversation and join our GB News community. You can even talk to me, Bev Turner, or any of the members of the GB News family.
Hi there, I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm going to take a second to tell you all about my show, Dubes & Co. We start off with the issues of the day. We then bring in both sides of the argument. We get rid of the disrespect. And then you throw me into the mix. And trust me, I'll tell it exactly how it is. And then, of course, the magic ingredient, you at home. We mix it all together and what have we got, in my opinion, the best debate show in town. Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Your lunchtime update on the stories that matter across the UK.
From breaking news and insightful analysis, inspiring stories and lively debates.
You're comparing yourself to a former Prime Minister.
Which is it?
Stay informed, stay updated, stay entertained.
I just don't know how anyone would not want to be there.
Every weekday from midday.
We are Good Afternoon Britain, only on GB News.
Britain's news channel.
It's 9 p.m. I'm Patrick Christys. Tonight.
So my government will fight every day until you believe again.
Everything is now Sir Keir Starmer's problem. But who's he got dealing with it?
I said live on TV, and I say to this day, if me resigning as an MP now would bring a ceasefire, I would do it.
And here's our Foreign Secretary on Mastermind.
Who acceded to the English throne at the age of 9 on the death of his father Henry VIII in 1547?
Henry VII.
Edward VI.
And here he is saying Brexiteers are Nazis.
Implication, you're comparing the ERG to the Nazi party, or at least to the South African racists. Now, whatever you think about the ERG, that was an unacceptable comparison, wasn't it?
Andrew, I would say that wasn't strong enough.
Well, it's nice to see the left are taking Farage's success really well.
Are you downwind of a couple already? You've had a bigger lunch than I've had.
Could Suella lead the Tory fight back?
I'm sorry that my party didn't listen.